As the car pulled up to the curb, all eyes turned to the man stepping out. He was tall, composed, and carried an air of quiet confidence. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly, his previously commanding tone faltering. The son, dressed sharply and moving with purpose, glanced at his mother before locking eyes with the officer. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The woman's neighbors watched with bated breath. Some whispered about who the son might be. His presence alone seemed to hold weight. Was he someone important? A lawyer? A figure of authority? The officer hesitated, struggling to maintain control of the situation. He stammered something about a misunderstanding, but the tension was thick. Meanwhile, the elderly woman stood a little taller now, her son by her side. What was it about him that changed everything so quickly? The answers remained unclear, but the atmosphere promised a revelation. The son stepped closer, his presence commanding attention. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone measured but sharp. He looked to his mother, silently asking if she was okay. She nodded slightly, though the worry in her eyes hadn't faded. The officer, now visibly uneasy, avoided the son's gaze and fumbled with his words. The neighbors murmured, piecing together bits of what they had seen. Some remembered the son from years ago. He'd left the neighborhood, gone on to bigger things. A few speculated he worked in law, while others suggested he might have connections in local government. Meanwhile, the officer seemed to be scrambling for control. He started explaining something about a call he'd received, but his story didn't quite add up. The son tilted his head, listening carefully, his expression unreadable. "So you showed up here and decided my mother was the threat?" he asked, his voice steady but cutting. The officer froze. Everyone was waiting for his response. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence unraveling under the son's calm but relentless questioning. "It wasn't like that," the officer stammered. "We had a report of suspicious activity in the area, and I was just doing my job." The son folded his arms, his gaze never leaving the officer. "Suspicious activity? On this porch? From my mother? A retired school teacher?" His voice was steady, but each word hit like a hammer. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their murmurs growing louder. Some were recording on their phones, the weight of the moment captured in every lens. The tension was unbearable. The officer looked around, as if searching for support, but no one spoke up. The elderly woman, still silent, watched her son with a mix of pride and apprehension. The son took another step closer, lowering his voice, but somehow making it even more commanding. "Tell me," he said, "what exactly did you think would happen here?" The officer opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the sound of another car approaching broke the silence. Every head turned. Who could it be now? The story had reached its boiling point, and no one could predict what would come next. The second car pulled up slowly, its sleek design catching the late afternoon light. A man stepped out, dressed in a crisp suit, his face calm but serious. The neighbors whispered again, trying to figure out who he was. The officer's expression shifted from uneasy to outright alarm. It was clear he recognized this man. The suited man approached with deliberate steps, his presence somehow amplifying the tension. "Officer," he said firmly, "I'd like to have a word." His tone carried authority, the kind that demanded immediate attention. The son glanced at the new arrival, exchanging a brief look that hinted at familiarity. The officer, now visibly sweating, stumbled over his words, trying to explain himself. "It's not what it looks like. There was a report." The man in the suit cut him off. "We'll get to that. But for now, I need you to stand down." His command was sharp, leaving no room for argument. The crowd grew silent, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. The elderly woman stood frozen, clutching her son's arm. Who was this man, and why did his presence change the entire dynamic? The answers were coming, but the stakes had just been raised, and no one could predict what would happen next. The officer hesitated, his posture stiff as the man in the suit took control of the situation. "I've already reviewed the report," the man said, his voice sharp and steady. "And it doesn't mention anything that justifies harassing this woman on her own property." The officer opened his mouth to argue, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "This stops now." The crowd was completely still, the weight of the moment palpable. The officer, realizing he had no choice, reluctantly stepped back. He muttered something about miscommunication and retreated to his patrol car, his face flushed with embarrassment. The neighbors exchanged glances, their unease slowly giving way to relief. The suited man turned to the son, offering a firm handshake. "Your mother deserves better than this," he said, his tone softer now. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The son nodded, his expression one of quiet gratitude. Just as the tension seemed to lift, the man leaned closer to the son and said something that only he could hear. The son's eyes widened for a split second, his calm demeanor faltering. He glanced at his mother, then back at the man, a mix of surprise and unease crossing his face. The man stepped away without further explanation, leaving behind an air of mystery. As the second car drove off, the neighbors began dispersing, still murmuring about what they had witnessed. The son helped his mother back inside, her hand gripping his arm tightly. Whatever the man had said, it was clear the story wasn't over yet. Continue from where the climax left off and write 150 words wrapping up the story. This part should provide a satisfying resolution, answer any remaining questions, and conclude subplots. Leave the audience with key takeaways or reflections, making the ending memorable and engaging. Naturally, include keywords to keep that SEO optimization strong. End the story now in natural way, also do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also don't create violated content, which can affect YouTube policy.